Hi guys, so it's been a while since I first published about Amazon's leadership principles, and in today's video I wanted to give you a quick preview if you're just getting started with your interview prep. So first of all, why should you care about these principles? Okay, so you should care about them primarily because you'll be screened on some, if not most of them, during primarily your on-site interview. Okay, so if you're just prepping for a screening round or a telephone screening round, then you're actually in luck because these principles aren't the main thing at this point. Okay, even though I very much encourage you to keep watching this video as maybe as a quick introduction to them. Okay, and the second note before we begin, in a behavioral interview, the best candidate is the one with the best stories. Okay, so even if you already have a couple of great stories, unless you model and revise them to fit into these principles, you will risk not having prepared answers for the questions they'll ask you during your interview. So again, primarily for the on-site here. And I'll give examples of questions for these principles in a moment. So let's try to make this as an exercise. Can you challenge yourself to come up with a story for each of these principles as we go through them? So let's begin. Number one, customer obsession. Okay, so this is the core principle at Amazon. Some say this cannot be taught, and I'd maybe argue that it can be trained for if not taught. But an interesting remark, particularly for technical roles, a customer can be both external and internal. Okay, so what would be an interesting question for this principle? Well, tell me about the time when you delighted a customer. Okay, and maybe as a side note here, customer obsession is something particularly important for cloud companies nowadays. For example, Microsoft has also embedded it into its cultural attributes, okay, which is the equivalent, of course. Number two, ownership. So basically, you have to prove them you care. So for example, tell me about the time when you stepped in and helped with a task, even if it was outside of your area of expertise, but in your company's best interest. Okay, so this is one of the easier principles to prepare for. So hopefully you already have a story in mind here. Okay, number three, dive deep. Okay, so for example, tell me about the time when you had a complex problem which required in-depth analysis. So this principle requires you a story of a deep dive and essentially to showcase your subject matter expertise on something. Okay, on top of this, expect to get challenged on various hypotheses or even metrics if you want here. And maybe a quick note here, during a screening round, it's actually quite okay not to remember all the details, okay, of that project, of that experience. However, the expectations will evolve during the on-site interview. Okay, now let's move to more interesting principles at Amazon. That is the most interesting, probably, are right a lot. Okay, so why does this principle exist? Well, it primarily exists to screen senior roles on their ability to take the right decisions within ambiguous circumstances. And this expression, "are right a lot," is literally true. Okay, so great leaders are right a lot most of the time. So one example of great leaders, well, Amazon has quite a few, I believe so. Okay, now an interesting question to qualify someone on this principle would be, tell me about the complex decision you took in ambiguous circumstances. Next, earn trust. So earn trust is the principle most used to screen your listening skills, often within an interpersonal context here. And probably the most representative question would be, how do you deal with conflict inside your team? Okay, so it's an important principle, but pretty much self-explanatory. I believe, so long you have stories for that. Next, have backbone, disagree, and commit. Okay, so the most interesting question to test for this principle would be something on the lines of, tell me about the time when you disagreed with your boss but still had to deliver on the project or initiative. Also, an interesting note about this principle is something they call the backbone test, okay, where they actually test your agreeableness. Okay, in other words, if you're the type to agree just for the sake of social cohesion. Okay, next, frugality. So this one's not often used in screening, but more like for senior roles here. So I believe the title and descriptions are self-explanatory here, and probably the most interesting question for this principle would be a time when you saved money on something, okay, or time when you saved resources on something. Next one, hire and develop the best. This is again a principle often used to screen for more senior roles. However, I'd say most of you have had experiences of when you coached someone. This question happens to be a very common one to screen for this principle as well, time when you coach someone. Okay, so also you maybe notice a bit of overlap with earn trust, especially for the listening skills, for the interpersonal skills. By the way, your stories can and will often fit into multiple principles. Okay, now let's get to the more classic principles: invent and simplify. Okay, for example, time when you came up with an idea to simplify or to optimize a process. Okay. So again, a pretty much self-explanatory principle, and you notice there's maybe even a little bit of overlap with frugality for this question in particular. Okay. Next, learn and be curious. So the most representative question here would be, how do you stay inspired and learn new things? So again, a self-explanatory behavior. There's also a bit of overlap with invent and simplify in stories that I've heard over time. And also to be noted that Amazon added this principle back in 2015. So you may have noticed I'm just trying to simplify things here to give you a bit of context here, especially because I understand your time is of essence here, and more on this a little bit later. Next one, insist on the highest standards. Okay, so the best question here is a time when you relentlessly work to improve something, such as a process. Okay, so this principle exists primarily for the interviewer to determine how high your quality bar is set. So from experience, it can be challenging to showcase your high standards unless you spend some time to revise a little bit your story, especially for clarity of thought here. Also, another strong indicator of high standards is also attention to detail. Okay, deliver results. So what are they looking for here is someone capable to tackle challenges successfully. For example, time when you got stuck 75% through a project but still managed to deliver it successfully. Okay, so it's pretty self-explanatory, I believe. Bias for action. For example, tell me about the time when speed was essential to success of an initiative. Okay, so while this isn't complicated to understand, this principle is again used to screen for more senior types of roles. And without getting into too much detail here, an interesting read for you would be about Jeff Bezos' type 1 and type 2 decisions. So type 1 decisions are ones which can be taken quickly because they can be reversed. Okay, and the second type of decisions are the irreversible ones, and therefore because they require deep analysis. Okay, next one, think big. Best question, a time when you set a vision when there wasn't one. Okay, so again, a principle usually for more senior types of roles. Can you think of a time when you seeing the big picture was essential for the success of the operation? Okay, and just to close here, Amazon recently added 2 new principles. However, they don't really make sense for candidates. So the first would be strive to be Earth's best employer, and success at scale brings responsibility. Okay, so nothing to prepare here. So how many stories do you have so far? How many of these of these sample questions were you able to answer? This is what actually matters for you as a candidate. And let me please close here with 3 mistakes you want to avoid going into an interview with Amazon in particular. Number 1, most of you will grossly underestimate the time it takes to become good with these things. That is behavioral interviews. And if I may give you a tip here, it can take 6 months or even more to prepare a proper behavioral interview. Okay. Second mistake to avoid. You start Googling for questions and prepare as many answers as possible, as compared to first prepare on behaviors, on these principles. They give you the sample answers for each instead of the questions. And once you have your initial story bank ready, then you may start answering as many questions as you like. Okay. And last but not least, definitely not least, Amazon publicly endorses the STAR method to answer behavioral questions. And after helping thousands of you with your interview prep, I can confirm it is essential to communicate your answers so they can easily understand you. I wish you good luck with your interview, and thank you very much for watching.